welcome to the lecture, Sharon Allicotti's lecture. We are very happy to have you here. As you know, we organize the exhibits and have a lecture and a walkthrough as part of the shows, and Sharon is going to be back on October 27th, Tuesday at noon.
Is it the 27th?
Right. Yeah.
It's not the 27th? I thought it was the 23rd, but that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, maybe it is.
We'll double check. It doesn't matter.
We'll double check.
Either day is fine.
And I just wanted to thank the students here from the Gallery Museum Studies class. Raise your hands. Vincent and Pat and Gail, because we are a very small gallery with 2 staff people, myself and Pat Vine, and we get the help from our students to actually be able to set up and put up the shows. So thanks to them. And thanks to also all the people who helped in the reception. I don't know everybody's name, but thanks everybody. I also want to mention that the show was curated by Carlos Herrera, who couldn't be here tonight, but he was actually the one who invited Sharon to come here and show her work, and he's the one that selected the wonderful pieces. And just briefly, I think that her work resonates for Southern Californians because she depicts people in their cars and the kind of arid landscape that we're all used to. And I live in Chula Vista, and day by day I see how the land gets destroyed as new suburbs get built, and we have to travel further and further to get back into nature. And I think her works kind of speak to our need to go back and to be able to engage both with nature and to find ourselves in that solitude that we can only find there. Already a lot of students have mentioned, how amazing her work is, the incredible realism. You can see, the glint on the hairs of the arm of the model. You can see the sheen on the leather of the car. And I think that as we get lost in those details, it also is in tune with the kind of meditative state of the models that she depicts. So I just want to thank her for being here, and without anything else, I'll just pass it on to her. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessandra. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be exhibiting. Thank you all for attending the show and now the lecture. Hopefully, I will give you some insight and some information on my work, which you may be interested in hearing. Normally, the way I conduct talks of this sort is I allow, it's very casual, and I allow for questions to be interspersed between what I'm saying. But since I'm being, this is being recorded actually in video form, I think what I will do is leave the question and answer session towards the end. I'm very happy to address questions, and in fact, as I said, I normally like to conduct my lectures that way, a little more free form. If you have anything, if there is any image up here, perhaps we can backtrack to it. I know that's the one thing that's perhaps not convenient about it, is that you may have a question about an image, but if you can kind of just try and keep it in mind, I could always go back to it. I guess we'll go ahead and start with the slides. I'm actually going to be showing you some work which leads up to the current series. It's probably interesting to see not only preliminary work, which I'll also have slides of, but kind of the genesis of my current series, which is the auto interiors theme, I guess you could call it that, with the, the desert landscapes. So I guess without further ado, we will hit the lights and get the slide projector going. I'm going to show you some earlier works, again to give you some idea of how I got where I am now. I've always been interested in the idea of using figure and interior. The idea of doing an interior separately, a still life separately, a figure separately, those are all certainly viable, I guess you could call them forms or realist genre. But I've always been interested in combining, the different forms In the case of my current series, I'm combining the landscape with the figure, with the interior, it's automobile interior specifically. If there is no figure there are still life objects which suggest the presence of the figure. So I still consider them to be suggestive of the figure, even though it's actually technically a still life interior with a landscape. This work was actually done about 1985, and I suppose it's appropriate to start with this. It's actually a self-portrait. That's not really important. I really don't consider my works to be portraits particularly, but the title of it is the reader's reflection, and the idea of being in a reflective, meditative state of mind is a continuing theme that runs through my work. This piece, there is somewhat of an exterior view, but it's actually very simple. It just shows another side of the house, kind of the facade of the house, and there's also a mirror there. The idea of using windows and mirrors in room interiors, again, is a subject, a theme which has fascinated me, and historically, Dutch painters from such as Vermeer, who's actually an artist who worked during the Baroque period, although a lot of people don't think of him as Baroque. They think of Caravaggio as being Baroque. But historically, the idea of putting a figure in a room, again, in this kind of a state of repose and reflection has really fascinated me. One of the things that I do is also that you'll notice throughout my work with the poses is that I don't really show the figures in poses which would suggest motion or gesticulation, anything that's particularizing about them that would tend to narrow your associations. I'm really interested in having works have a kind of resonance to them, a kind of quiet dignity for the most part. That has remained a constant. In the case of these works, I really wasn't working with, and this is a pastel, I really wasn't working with the idea of involved detailed landscapes being seen through the window. But nevertheless, there was a suggestion of exterior light coming into the interior space. One of the things that I do say about my fascination with the interior and why I think I go back to it, it's kind of my leitmotif, it's the theme I return to again and again. I've wondered why, and really, I suppose that's an appropriate way to start a lecture with a question, why? And when you're a figurative realist, the first question is usually about your subject matter, and that's usually what people are interested in. They may be interested in other aspects of it, perhaps your technique. There may be some other questions, but I think central to it would be the why of the imagery. Why interiors? Why not just landscapes? Why not just figures alone? And so I really should start the lecture saying that. And in some ways, it's a hard question to answer, except that I continue to be, I suppose, almost, you can almost feel like, gosh, it's almost an obsession, going back to it and going back to it. But I think that it's something, one of the ways that I suppose I've kind of interpreted it as, is that for me, and I do say this in my statement, it seems somehow metaphorical for the contained sensation you have of your body, of being inside and looking out, is a sensation that always fascinated me, even as a child, being inside of a space and then looking out. And the only thing I can think it may have to do with, and perhaps a psychologist would have more to say about that, is this idea of security, privacy, and then looking out on the world. And later, the exterior for me, I think in some ways kind of symbolizes the sublime, really the profound mystery of the mind. That's where things really allude to ideas which are less immediate and go kind of above and beyond. As I said, that the sublime is probably the best word for it. What I'll be showing you with these slides, let's see if I can get this right. I wanted also to show you, since people are often interested in drawings and in the kind of support work or studies which go into the production of very involved, resolved images, such as the kind of work that the large pieces that are in the show. I have chosen to show some of the preliminary work, the studies, of which there are a number of things that I would do in preparation. So this is a small charcoal that was actually a self-portrait, for that, obviously, for the study. It wasn't the figure, the me that's sitting, but actually the reflected view. And I remember doing this and setting up a couple of mirrors, actually, to be able to get that reflection. You not looking directly, me not as the subject, not looking directly. Again, one mirror wouldn't have done the trick. I needed a couple of them. I also did do a study for the figure, that was the actual figure depicted, not the reflection. But I don't like that one as well, so I chose not to show it. But, again, this gives you some idea of some of the studies. And, of course, the exhibit has some of my preliminary studies. This one, by the way, the previous image, I guess people sometimes wonder about sizes. That previous image was probably, it's been a while since I've had that, and that one sold a long time ago, so I don't even know. That image is actually, I guess, it's 42 by 56. Gee, I didn't remember it being that big. This one is 1986. It's about 55 by 60, so it's pretty big. It's bigger, actually. It's larger than any of the images that are in the show. I actually work smaller now than I used to. Again, the idea of an interior, and you'll see in these, as was characteristic for this period in my work, you'll see an exterior view outside of the window, but certainly nothing that's very elaborate or involved as as a landscape depiction. Usually just an indication of sky or light or some such thing. I'm not really going to show you too many of these. There are a number of others where sometimes you'll see a building facade or clouds or both. There are a few that are that way. But again, the idea of a sense of anticipation and mystery, but at the same time, someone who's reflective, who seems to be lost in reverie. I've always been more interested in depicting the figure in that state. Again, as I say, as opposed to motion or activity. That's actually, again, it remains a constant throughout my work, and that relates to the idea of, for me, an extended moment in time as opposed to a frozen moment. I pose my figures in poses which they could comfortably hold for, a number of minutes, if not maybe, half an hour, 20 minutes to a half an hour at a time. So they're not really frozen moments like some artists who are figurative will show a figure caught in action, basically balancing on tiptoe almost. And for my work, I've never been interested in depicting the figure that way, but rather, again, this idea of an extended moment. And the Dutch painters that I'm talking about, painters such as Van Eyck, who was a Renaissance, Northern European Renaissance painter, to another Dutch artist, well, there's others too, but certainly Vermeer later, that show interiors. In the case of Vermeer, domestic interiors, there is that sense that the figure could comfortably hold that pose for an extended moment. So in terms of how I'm dealing with time, the property of time in my work, it is really the extended moment as opposed to the frozen moment. This is actually my sister, and in fact, she is the model that is depicted on the announcement with the desert landscape behind her, and this is an earlier. She's actually been one of my favorite models for a long time. I've even as an undergraduate student, I used to get her up earlier in the morning, and she'd sit at the table and I'd paint her. She was really a good sport about it, and I didn't even pay her. I would treat her to lunch and things like that as a student. I wasn't able to afford anything to give her, but she's just a natural, and she was always good at it. Let's see. This one is actually a smaller piece. It's probably about maybe close to 36 inches square. Similar in the idea of the figure in the interior. The landscape outside is pretty simplified. I do have details, and also this technique's a little, you'll probably notice, is a little bit looser, I guess, if you want to use that term, compared to the work that's in the show, which is certainly very labor-intensive and tight, although there still is a lot of layering of pastel that goes into this technique. So there's a close-up, so you can see, again, it's a smaller piece, and you can see actually, a lot of the paper showing through in this one. And then I'll show you a charcoal study that was actually kind of preliminary for this. Obviously, it's pretty close to what I ended up with. And that work was done about I'd say about 1991, maybe 92. This one's probably about, I think it's 93. Again, this one bears some similarity to the previous one, showing something that's pretty characteristically California, though, the idea of a swimming pool outside of the window. And again, you'll see some similarities between this one and the first slide, which I showed you, which is the idea of the model being reflected in a mirror. Again, the ideas of mirrors, doorways, windows have always been fascinating to me. This is also a pastel. The size on this one is it's 22 by 42, essentially, somewhere around there. Yeah, and this is 94. And I do have some close-ups of this. This one is more, tends to be more refined. It's, I'm getting more detailed at this point. And I have to say that at this time, I actually did start doing, or just prior to this, at this time I was working simultaneously with the interior and then also beginning to experiment with the idea of the auto interior. This is actually an oil painting. All of the images I've showed you up to this point, save for the sketches in charcoal, this is actually an oil painting. And it's about 24 by 48, actually. As I was saying before, the idea of using an interior with some sort of architectural view out the window, that's certainly this one. I'm also interested with interiors. I was always interested in different vantage points. The idea of taking a low vantage point here, I thought was an interesting idea. You end up seeing a lot of the ceiling. My work is very, very carefully and very deliberately composed. I'm not one that works very spontaneously, except when I'm doing, for instance, a rapid figure study. I certainly do those kinds of drawings. But for these very resolved works, there's a great deal of planning and a very deliberate composition that goes on. That's really, certainly one of the most important aspects of my work is the composition. I mean, it's everything. If you're going to spend, as I often say, on some of these large images that are in the large pieces that are in the show, if you're spending, several hundred hours on them, you don't want to leave too much to chance. From the time I begin applying the pastel to the surface, at the time that I'm doing that, there will have been a great deal of preliminary work. And I'm always making alterations, up until the time I start with the composition, and very often. And I'm very interested in structure, both 2- and 3-dimensional structure. And of course, when I say 3-dimensional structure, I'm talking about illusionism, obviously not real structure, but illusionistic structure. And certainly perspective comes into play, but I hasten to add that the perspective is modified. I'm always modifying, even though my work is really meant to appear as a plausible viewing experience, I'm making a lot of adjustments with such things as proportion, and they're very subtle, to be sure, but they're important, with the perspective, the proportion, and the tonality and the color as well. So what you're getting, in the end may seem, it's kind of deceptively simple, I guess you could say, but it's the result of a lot of editing, adjusting, and certainly, as I said, very well thought out composition. And I think I have there's a detail. Again, this is an oil, actually, oil on canvas. And then this is a preliminary study that I did. This is a preliminary study that I did in Conti crayon, black and white Conti crayon. Sometimes these slides are warped, so we don't. Yeah, this is actually black and white Conti crayon on toned paper that I did. It really varies from piece to piece. With some pieces, I do some very, very developed studies prior to them. All of them will have some kind of a compositional layout, but occasionally I'm interested in, typically the figure, I would say, in doing a separate study, which I suppose could be considered a work in its own right. Not just a study, not just something that's dependent on the final product, but the large piece for its worth. And here's another one of Jacqueline. Those of you that know Jacqueline and have worked with her. She actually is in a number of my pieces. This is an oil on linen, and the date on this one, this was probably about 96, I would say. Actually, it's 96 or 97, somewhere between there, and it's 23 by 29. Again, we've got the interior-exterior mirror, but here I'm beginning to get more interested in depicting the landscape, to the landscape itself to a much more developed, studied degree. And although this isn't a desert landscape, it is actually an area of Southern California. It's the Santa Ynez Valley area that's up kind of by San Luis Obispo, that area. As I said, I ended up, this was the first piece where I really spent a lot more time and was focused on the idea of depicting the landscape with greater interest and intensity. Again, the idea of really bringing together still life, room interior, figure, and then also exterior view landscape. And I think this one actually, I'll show you a detail of that. We got a spot on that, don't we? She doesn't really have a beauty mark there. Another detail. Again, this is oil on linen. The surface characteristics are a little bit different with linen than with canvas. And then this is, this is a case where I did an entire study which really is a work in its own right, although it replicates both in size and imagery, the oil painting. I did this one first before I did the painting, and this is basically charcoal and Conti crayon. And it is the same size. Again, it's a full size. It's unusual that I would do this developed of a work in conjunction with one of the others. But I think that too, one of the reasons I might guess that one of the reasons I did this is because, as you can see from the show, I moved away from oil paint and specialized in pastel. And the fact of the matter is that I love drawing. I love having a drawing implement in my hand. And that's one of the reasons that I think I went to pastel, because it combines properties of paint and a drawing medium in one medium. And I think for me that the idea of painting where you've got something out here and there's this sense of removal with the brush and you've got this palette of colors out here, and then it seems like it's almost like deprivation to me. I like to be in direct contact with the surface, and when I have a stick in my hand, whether it's a stick of charcoal, a stick of graphite, or a pastel, or even something that's a pencil that's encased in wood, I like the resistance of something that's solid there when I'm working, and somehow that's really why I've tended to move away from painting and keep going back to pastel. And I think in the case of this one, I did a painting, but somehow I felt like I wanted some sort of a document that was a drawing too. And I really haven't painted. I haven't done it, save for a few life paintings and demonstrations for my students because I teach painting. I really have been using pastel exclusively since really about '97. So the last several years, I've been working pretty exclusively with pastel and have gotten away from oils. But I hasten to add, and I tell my students this, I was trained as a painter first, and I learned everything that I learned, everything that you see of color in my pastels was really learned from oil paint. Everything I learned about color and kind of a structural approach to painting, of using color, came from oil painting, which some people might think is kind of weird. It seems like pastel would be something that you'd start with, but in fact it wasn't. And I learned when I went to graduate school. I had been painting. I had done my undergraduate show, which was oil paintings, and I felt that when I went to graduate school, I told them I want to combine. I was also doing little figure studies, quicker figure life studies in pastel, and I told the faculty there, I want to somehow combine these two things. The important composed imagery of my oil paintings, these kind of sustained, developed efforts, which were room interiors too, with the medium of pastel. And that's what I ended up doing actually as a graduate student. Of course, it continued to do. Like I said, I've gone back to oil painting here and there again, but not really not really since, nothing important really in oil since 97. Detail. And speaking of oil, here's another oil. What's significant about this work and how it relates to the series is that that landscape out there is clearly a desert landscape. So this was really a pivotal piece for me in that we have the figure, room interior, another one of my my repeating themes, the idea of the figure being reflected. But this time the view out the window is a desert landscape, and this is actually an area in the Mojave Desert. This is an oil. This is actually an oil on linen, and the dimensions are similar to a few here. This one is actually 24 by 44, more or less. Again, this is where I shifted to this fascination with the idea of the desert. And again, the desert as a theme. The thing that I do mention in my statement is, and it's certainly very true, is that being a city dweller, even if you live in suburbia, we really lack vistas. We really don't have clear views through to distances, to great distances in landscape. And I'm making trips into the desert. I travel out there often, and I've been doing that for a number of years. And actually, the first time that I really got a lot of exposure to the desert, I used to ski a lot in my younger days up at Mammoth. And driving up 395, I found that I want, it's like, let me off here. I don't even need to go up skiing. I want to see, I want to spend time in the desert. There's something about the desert for me that makes me feel as if I'm where I should be. And I found myself into these forays into the desert. I began writing a lot of poetry. I find that it puts me in a state of mind which is really quite extraordinary and really difficult to achieve when I'm in my usual environment, which is suburban metropolitan. I actually live, just outside of Los Angeles now. For me, being in the desert, somehow the vastness of it, the sense of isolation, and certainly not in a lonely or negative sense, but it seems to empty the mind for me of everything that's trivial. The kind of static noise that, or this sense of things going through your head that you hear. I mean, we really are so accustomed to noise pollution, light pollution, all of these things when we're in proximity to a major metropolitan area. And when you're out in the desert, one of the first things you notice is it's just amazingly quiet. And the silence is so wonderful and striking, as are the landforms. And unlike landforms in other regions, the landforms are really laid bare. It's almost as if you get to see the land nude, almost like the figure nude. And again, for me, it's extremely evocative. And when the trivial goes out of your head, when you're silly daily cares and things that we become preoccupied with when we're in this kind of high tension environment that we're usually in the city. What comes in is this silence and really the poetic. So, and it's being in that state of mind which is most productive and creative for me. So I'm driven to depict it. In a sense, that's what I'm doing here. This is, I do have both a detail of this, and then I also have a small landscape you'll see that I did as a preliminary study. I did do a drawing of this. I didn't feel that great about it that I should show the slide. In fact, I may not have even made a slide of it. But one thing that I suppose I should say that you guys may be wondering about are my sources too. Just to give you an example, she wasn't actually in this environment, and actually, I'm using the sources that I use to create my images are actual sittings with models from observation, in this case of the still life too. Also photographs, particularly of the landscapes, because it can be impractical to try and work in the desert or inside of a car interior, for that matter. Couldn't fit the work that size in there. You couldn't fit your easel in there. And then also invention too. I invent things. Now, just to give you an example, the room interior that is reflected in the mirror and that lamp don't exist at all. And certainly aspects of the sort of buffet there was changed, so was the mirror. The landscape very often in my imagery will, if you were from that area, it would contain recognizable landforms. But very often the landscape, which is arrived at in the end and is composed, it's actually taken from places. It's kind of a composite landscape. There isn't any one part of the landscape in that area which would look that way. So those are the various sources that I'm drawing on to produce works which are very, very time-consuming. And this study is actually a gouache. It's about maybe 15. I think it's about 15 or 16 inches by maybe 22. Yeah, it's probably about 15 or 16 by 22. This is the landscape that you see in, that's called Young Dancer with the Latin Teapot. It's actually my cousin. This is the landscape that you see outside in a slightly different form. If you recall, I created just sort of a conical pile here. These were some mounds. I call this man-made mounds Mojave Desert. And it's actually a gouache and a pastel. So there's actually a painting, a transparent or kind of semi-transparent gouache under there, and then pastel worked over with pastel. And so this also can be an accompaniment, but also a work in its own right that goes with the image, with the final painting. It was preliminary to it, but it also... This, by the way, is the black and white that I showed you of Jacqueline, and then this one, and then some others. I'm also showing right now, and will for another week and a half at Mount St. Mary's College, so I have several pieces over there, and I'll let you know what those pieces are as we go along. This piece doesn't go with anything, although it was just acquired by the museum that I had my solo show at, because they had this one up. They had some of my small landscapes. This is over at Mount St. Mary's right now. So technically, it's on loan. But in any event, this is pastel, and it's just a landscape study. So you can see I began to, become very interested in the desert landscape and just even producing just landscapes that did not involve, sort of weaving that image in with other things, being seen through the vantage point of an interior or including a figure or a still life. And this one is this is about 22 by 30. And this one also is, it's not associated with or preliminary to any other study or any other larger works that I've done, and it's a 22 by 30 pastel. This is an area that's in the Owens Valley. Owens Valley is where I get a lot of my imagery from, and as an example, that road wasn't really there, and again, some things are, I end up moving things around to advantage because, and in that sense, I'm definitely not a plein air painter. Not only do I not stand there in the desert, except maybe to make a few sketches, but to produce this, but a lot of it's done in the studio, and it has to do with rearranging and recomposing because the landscape as it is may not, may be interesting, but may not make a good composition, may not make a good image, when you get it to a two-dimensional document. So I may change things quite a bit. And this is, of course, one of the pieces that's in the show. This was actually, I think this one's, really one of the earlier. This was actually done in, I think it's 93 or 94, and this was one of the earlier of the series. It's probably really the earliest piece of the series. There's a minor exception to this. I actually did back in 1982 a figure in a car with a landscape, and I wouldn't want to show that. It has a lot about it that's unsettling to me. Technically and also compositionally, but in any event, I really consider this to be the first of the series because from this point on, I start doing more and more to where I've been, like I said, exclusively doing the landscapes outside of the car, the car interior. I call them the car interior series, car interior desert landscape series. And of course, this one is called Driver's View, Owens Valley. And it's actually, it seems like a lake out there, but it's kind of a mirage, although it may have had some very shallow water in it. But this is actually an area off 395. And the cars that I use, I'd probably, one of the questions I know people ask about is, it always amazes me, and not to stereotype, but it's usually men that ask me what kind, that's a such and such car, and they seem real interested in the sort of car that it is. And I have to tell you that that's not really important to me, save for the fact that I'm not interested in using newer cars because somehow, and I know I was just talking to Bruce about this, but older cars seem to have a history to me, and it doesn't, as an image of car, you kind of have to be careful. With newer ones, it can end up looking like an advertisement for a car. Somehow they don't have the kind of character and sense of history that an older car does. And my dad has always had a bunch of older cars, much to my mother's chagrin. But I've used a lot of his, and then others that I even find out in car junkyards out in the desert, especially Utah. There's a lot of car junkyards there where I'll sort of pick a car. But again, the car itself is very often modified. This was actually a composite of two cars, and it was these are both 70s cars. One was that I sort of pulled together to create this car interior. It was a Cordoba and a Ford, I don't know if it was a Fairmont or something like that, some god-awful car. And my dad had both of these, and I sort of pulled them together to create this composite car. I picked design aspects of both of them, picked and chose for what I wanted, ultimately. And those are my sister's shoes. Oh, and the story about that one, which is perhaps interesting, is that I originally intended to show my sister seated in the car. And I was sketching her and taking photos, and then she got up and walked away and left her shoes on the seat. And the rest is history. So. This one is also a fairly early one. This is, I think, this is a fairly long one. Let me see if I can see the dimensions on this. I think it's about 50 inches long. It's actually 27 by 52, on the high side of 52. And this one's called The Passenger. And this is 1995. Again, involvement with the landscape, but less so. If you look at this piece in the show, you'll see a little bit less in the way of obsessive detail that some of the other pieces have. Also, just technically speaking, in this piece, I used all pastels and not pastel pencils. I've been bringing the work to a level of detail which has necessitated using actual pastel pencils that you can sharpen to a point. So this one has somewhat of a looser look for that reason. This piece actually has been exhibited a lot, and in fact, a few years back, I won a really handsome reward for it, which was nice. It was several $1,000s in national competition. So it's kind of done the tour. It's been around, and my friend Wendy is delighted about that since her mug has been seen everywhere. One of the things that I find interesting too is that, again, I'm not looking to narrow. I have to say that one of the reasons that people ask about the expressions on my models' faces very often, and again, as I said, I'm not looking to have the model. I'm not looking to pose the model in poses or with facial expressions, which tend to particularize the possible interpretations. Instead, I want the work to have the capacity for expansive, broader interpretations. I'm endlessly fascinated when people look at my works and say. They've often given me very elaborate narratives of what is going on in that image, what the model is thinking, and clearly what they have been through and what has happened. And I have to tell you that I'm fascinated by that. It isn't my intention, but at the same time, I'm not at all disturbed or bothered or disappointed by that kind of reaction. In a sense, it does indicate that I'm in many ways accomplishing what I wanted, because I really wanted the work to be capable of any number of interpretations rather than tending to narrow the possible interpretations. And that's why I say the work is narrative in a very broad sense. There is not a specific story which is being told, but rather more like poetry where you can read it again and again. It's very open-ended. I want it to be that way. If people are bringing their own kind of baggage, whatever, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but they're bringing their own ideas and imagination. Really, that's what it is. That's great. I think that's wonderful. This image is actually my husband, and this piece is also in the Mount St. Mary's show. And it will also be at the it's been at the Representing LA show, which was up at the Frye Museum in Seattle. Perhaps some of you know about the show. It'll be a great show. Not because my work's in it necessarily. There's just a bunch of wonderful artists in the show. But it's going to be at Laguna Beach opening beginning of November. So this work has toured. This one, really the car is very generic. It doesn't have really any specific features which would identify it as any car in particular, although it's probably, knowing my father, it's my father's cars. I've been working with so many Fords in particular. But in any event, just to give you an example, this piece, the landscape, this is a completely composite landscape, but this is all invented. Everything over here is invented, and the mountain range in this area is probably invented too. So, these were all just taken from different, from photographs that were taken in a number of, kind of in the same area, and then also, as I said, quite a bit of invention. And he was not in the car. He was just seated in a chair when I worked from him. So, again, these things are pulled together and didn't really exist. I get a lot of stories about what's going on with him. A lot of people see it as kind of high anxiety and whatnot. But for me, it's really posing the model. Perhaps, they're in a moment of sort of inspired intensity, thinking, reflecting, thinking. Again, that's the state of mind that I'm in, where I get most of my ideas. And this one, with this piece, this is the piece that I started using the pastel pencils, particularly for the details in the face, so it becomes very, very tight. I have to say that historically, as I've said, the Northern Renaissance painters, people like Van Eyck, certainly, the level of detail that he had in his work, although I shudder to speak of him in conjunction with my own work. I wouldn't put any slides of his work up because I wouldn't want to be juxtaposed with what I think is he's one of the greatest painters that ever lived. Someone like Durer, and there are certainly others, but really it's that level of detail. When I look at those artists, I feel like they're kindred spirits. Perhaps I should have been born in that era, although it would have been tough being a woman trying to be a painter, but I feel a real kinship with that kind of naturalism. When artists really in the early Renaissance got, really brought naturalism and realism in painting to really its highest level. And that's the work which I found very inspiring. I guess one could say that it was an influence, but really I kind of discovered them. I just think that they're just artists of, artists have many different ways of working, and by no means this is the only way. It's not for everyone, believe me. You have to be a little obsessive compulsive to want to work like this, but it's just the sensibility of wanting to being so interested in the minutia of what one sees. I'm a very optical realist, and those artists which I mentioned certainly are. There's some details of various parts. And on to this one, which is of course in the show. This one, again, here you have still life objects, which suggests clearly the presence of the figure. I've had a lot of people create narratives such as where is the person, and an interesting review I had, the main Phoenix newspaper art critic, John Villani, was talking about, he was looking at my work and talking about the mystery, and for him, he interpreted it as, are these people, did some sort of criminal event take place, For him, it posed questions, but I was really gratified to have him say it could be this or it could be that. You don't know which way to go, and for him, the end result was mystery, which is certainly, the greater part of my intention. And this work, what can I say about this? This one, again, very carefully composed. And even though the landscape, just as an example, the landscape that I used the photos from, the sun was out full. There were no clouds in the sky. So I changed the light completely in it to where it was just what you call cloudy bright. The clouds were largely invented, perhaps taken from other photo sources. This rain pool did exist, but the tire tracks going through it did not form that arc. That was very conscious on my part to put it that way, to repeat some of the rounded forms in the hat. the more middle ground elements were brought in and were very, very much not together, and I pulled them all together. So again, the landscapes are very often composite, as I say. They're brought from kind of disparate areas and then pulled together in the final product here. And there's a close-up of that. And again, areas, these kinds of areas that are in, the cracked ground, what happens is that out in the desert there, you have an area where water settles. This is what occurred here. The water dried up, you had that fissuring and cracking, that sort of mosaic pattern, and then when the rain came again, it refilled back over it, and I was fascinated by that. But a lot of that work is done, the real fine work like that is done with pastel pencil. Just a technical aside. That one, the previous slide, by the way, was called Backseat View, Mojave Rain Pool. This one is called The Abandoned Mine, and this is actually in an area, in the same area as the landscape came from. These two pieces were done very, pretty much at the same time. This one was actually a little more recent. But out in the area, there's a little town called Randsburg that's off the 395 if you're heading out towards the Owens Valley, and it's pretty much abandoned. It's like a ghost town there. It's just the most mysterious. I drive out there and through there a lot, and there's often no one around. There's all these houses that seem shut up, and you think, where are people? But there are people that live there, and the people that live there are rock hounds. They're people who mine for, I guess, semi-precious stones. I really don't know much about it, but I know that it's fascinating. I mean, this is really kind of an eyesore to some people. There's some serious erosion which has occurred here because of their mining activities. But to me, I found this really to be a fascinating and really kind of terribly beautiful landform. It really was created because of in some senses, abuse of the land. But one of the things about the landscapes that you'll see in my work is I'm not really interested in using landscapes which are well known as being traditionally scenic, your sort of postcard locations, locales. I'm interested in areas which are kind of off the beaten track, that are considered wasteland, badland. They haven't been, interestingly enough, they've been exploited in one way, but not in another. If you go to Monument Valley, I mean, there's been so many photographs done of that. It's just so beautiful and so scenic. It can just make you sick, because you see so many calendar and whatever Sunset Magazine pictorial, photographic documentation of it. And I'm interested in discoveries, in finding beauty in that which one would not think would be capable of, I mean, these are the kinds of things people would either ignore or say, isn't that awful? But for me, it's fascinating, and as I said, really beautiful in its own right. And again, this is an instance where the sun was very bright that day, but I eliminated strong shadows and created kind of a cloudy bright, and then added the high clouds there, which were not there. This area over here is completely invented, again, to give you some idea about how I work. This area, these landforms right in here were completely invented. There was actually nothing. I just did it from imagination. This is some sort of weird mining apparatus. I'm not sure if you know anyone who does this kind of work. And I just like the idea of the mystery of gloves. Again, certain articles of apparel are interesting: shoes, hats, gloves, to suggest the presence of the figure without the figure being there. And also this car, again, was kind of composite, and the seat wasn't actually torn. My dad's had some cars that are in great states of disrepair. This wasn't one of them, but I made it so. I also made the cracking on the back there, whatever you call that area of the car in the back, with the back window. So I aged the car to give it a lot more character. I was also interested in relating kind of a state of decrepitude in the car to the landforms, the landscape outside. And a close-up of that. Yeah, a lot of time goes into these, into producing little blades of grass and, these very involved landforms. And also the, to describe the hat, the weaving on the hat is almost as much of a job as it would be to weave that hat. It's, the stitches, everything. Once you work at a certain level of detail, you set yourself up for an expectation, and you have to, you kind of set the bar, and you have to hurdle it. You have to deliver on it, and I guess one might think, there are times I think, what did I get myself into? When I started working at this detailed of a level, I think I did question that, and then I just went ahead, I forged ahead anyway. And here we have the image, of course, that's on the announcement. One of my students, it was interesting, she said, and again, I think she was reflecting, she was talking about the expression on her face, and she says, I don't know. She said, she looks pretty scared, you know. And I said, well, you know, it's funny, though, I know my sister, and when I look, I see her impish smile in there, and it's almost as if, no, she looks like she's smiling too much, because I know my sister is the sister. She's very humorous, very funny, and to me, that's what I see in this, and I didn't want it to be that way. But I have to tell you, and this is honestly the truth, this piece, you know, when I have it in my studio and I look at it every day, sometimes she looks to me like she's going to smile, and other times she does look scared. It even goes back and forth for me, which is absolutely a thrill. It can look different each day, and again, that's really at the heart of what I'm striving for. This landscape, you know, again, when I talk about, this is actually from an area in Utah, and kind of in south central Utah. I think it's called Luna Mesa area. But this, you know, again, this is a landscape that as you can see, it not only is it certainly couldn't have been considered scenic, it's not well protected at all. The off-roaders have had their way with this land, I mean, in no short order. For me, it was not only was it beautiful in an almost otherworldly kind of lunar way, but the patterns that are created by the tire tracks, to me, made this all the more wonderful than it would have been without them. I know that may sound terrible because, you know, some people consider that to be real terrible abuse of the land, but I like to think the land can recover from this. I suppose, you know, it is bad. I'm not really an ecologist, but frankly, to me, it absolutely was what made this landscape so arresting for me. Again, this really represents quite a composite. You know, this landform, both of the landforms that are in the distance, someone would recognize those certainly. There really wasn't a road like that, you know, that would lead up to the figure. I mean, or rather the car. This didn't really look like that. That wasn't really there, and certainly that part wasn't there either. I also changed the car quite a lot. The car really isn't very obvious in this, so the fact that it was I think it's an Acura. I changed it so much it sort of didn't matter, but I was interested in developing a relationship between, and I'm always doing this, I'm always looking for relationships. The parts, you know, certainly with the composition, a lot of what drives my compositional decisions are the relationships between the various parts that you see. I was interested in the essential triangularity of the figure and her head and how that played off the triangularity of really several of the landforms. The way that the car seat is kind of anthropomorphic and relates to the figure and how her shoulders are. These are things which I'm very conscious of. Oftentimes, I might when I'm doing the original setup and doing sketches, I may respond to that almost just intuitively, but very soon I discover what it was that was interesting me in that particular configuration, and I'll enhance it even. I'll take it a few steps further to really play off of that. So, you know, again, just to take you back and let you know what's going on in my mind when I develop the compositions, and of course, you know, there is a very detailed study, a fairly detailed study for this, but you can see the differences between the study and what I eventually arrived at. Also, the telephone wires didn't really look like that, but I decided that would be the most advantageous configuration to have them in. So there were telephone wires there, but they didn't look just like this. I think I probably have a detail. Yeah, well, you guys have seen this, certainly in the show. Again, the kind of loopiness that's in her hair, for me, really related to aspects of the landscapes, the tire tracks, the off-road vehicles tracks. Certainly, this vehicle is not capable of those kinds of climbs, but there's an interesting relationship between a vehicle and tire tracks and all that. And of course, the title of this is Tracks. And then the study, which is in the exhibit, this gives you some idea of how I work. This is full size. It's actually the exact same size. But you can see the kinds of changes. If you remember back to if you have your announcements, you can certainly refer to it. But particularly in the two peripheral areas there, the foreground landscape forms. I changed the configuration of the tire tracks. I also changed the shape of the seats. Here you can see that it doesn't have that sort of triangular pattern. And other things have been done. I didn't have, as you can see, there's no telephone wires, because at that point, again, as I've said, there isn't a lot that's left to chance. Once I begin putting the pastel on the paper, once I've transferred this drawing, and this is what I do, I make full-size, what you call a cartoon, technically, there isn't going to be a lot in the way of major modifications, but changes are certainly possible, as you can see, and certainly modifications. They're just usually not major. But this gives you an idea of how I work. Again, my working method, and what kind of changes can take place close up. And this was done from sittings, actually. And I changed her hair, as you can see in the final one. She had more height to her hair. Her hair had a fluffier quality, and I was interested in emphasizing the more of a not stringy, I don't want to use that word, it sounds so, but almost like a wet, but the hair having a sense of more substance to it because of the relationship between that and the exterior. Well, this slide has some kind of weird stain in it, right in the middle of it. I don't know how that happened. But anyway, this one, of course, is in the show as well. And this one is called South of Second Mesa, and in fact that's where the landscape comes from. It's an area, Second Mesa in Arizona, which is kind of in the upper, if you're looking at the map, in the upper right corner, so it would be the northeast corner area of Arizona. And I was very much interested in repeating triangular motifs in this. There's a lot of little things that for me, and when I tell people this, it's interesting. If they're artists, they often pick up on it. Other times they're real surprised that that's what I was thinking of. So again, the car interior, an older car, and certainly the idea of the car door being open, of being able to see the landscape. Again, this does represent landforms, but they were pulled together composite to maximum advantage compositionally for what I wanted to do. And again, this kind of repeating triangle that comes from, there's a lot of things that I'm looking at, just to give you some idea. The way that this kind of landform relates to certain aspects of the figure, even the extent to which this kind of wrapping around kind of relates to his hand wrapping around. This neck-like form really does relate to the neck for me. So I'm always looking for those kinds of resonances, which come from relating, again, in this case, the landscape to the figure, or even aspects of the interior to the figure. Close up there, and when I'm doing a male model, I know I have my work cut out for me, because there's always the 5 o'clock shadow, and then the hair on the arms. As was one write-up that I had in Phoenix, she was talking about the detail down to the light glinting off the arm hair on the male model. And here is the study. This is, it's on vellum. It's like it's really very much like the one that's in the show. That's of my sister. It's full size. It's a cartoon. You'll see some changes in the landscape. A few things were changed, but a lot of it's pretty similar. Certainly, the car interior is not changed much. And I adhered pretty closely to the car in this. This is a 1962. A Dodge Polara. It's my husband's cousin's car, and I found it sufficiently interesting, but once I started doing all that fluting, I think I had to question my sanity about why I picked this car. The tufting of fluting that's in the upholstery. And this is that model. This is actually a study I did. That model, Jason, who I use a lot now, that piece was really the first time I had used him. I had done some drawings of him, just some life drawings and things, but that's the first time I used him for a major piece. And so I wanted to do studies that were, to sort of explore what he was like. And he really is a wonderful model, as you can see. But this is not the pose which we ended up with, but I had him come to my studio and do a couple of different poses. And this one I did of him, and I liked it just I mean, I suppose I decided it was good enough in its own right, so I was going to sketch, actually do a fairly detailed, obviously, image in graphite. And we get to dry birth with our lovely model Jacqueline Gold here, who again, you saw her in one of my previous pieces. This one is I suppose a little different than some of the others. It's vertical. I do have some other vertical pieces, but I had the idea, to give you some idea about how I work, I had the idea, the concept for this piece in mind probably close to 2 years before I actually started on the piece. And I knew I wanted to do a red car. I needed a red car for this, and it has something to do, I call it dry birth. The car in this one, for me, just almost becomes a womb-like structure. And I knew I needed it to be red. I had to search around for a red car. I was poking through car graveyards out in Utah and found a red car, made a lot of photographs of it. I was telling someone who was at the show that I had to, I mean, it was really an awful condition. It had rat's nests in it and things like that, and certainly I would not have asked Jacqueline to pose in it. But back in my studio, I constructed a sort of a makeshift car seat out of just built up things, and had padding and put red fabric over it so that I could get the right kinds of what we call ambient color, reflected color onto her. So she was actually in the comfort, hopefully she was comfortable in my studio when she posed, and but through art, she's in the desert in Utah here, in this case, in an old red car. What's interesting about this one, you'll see in the study, is that the purse came later. Again, the changes that can occur are sometimes the addition or deletion of an object. I probably should have said that early on, back when you saw the one with the gloves, in that piece originally, I didn't have the gloves there. And I remember thinking, something needs to be there. It just has to be there. And I was talking to my husband about that. And he says, oh, no, don't put something there. It'll get too busy. I said, no, there needs to be something there. I want the... And then when I put the gloves there, he came in, and he goes, shoot, that really works. It is interesting to get information from him. He's a filmmaker and a photographer, actually, so he does have certainly a sense of the visual and of pictorial ideas. But this one, as I said, I talked to my husband about this, and he was excited about the idea. And then we found this red car in Utah. But like I said, that was probably 2 years before I actually had Jacqueline come to the studio and pose. And what's interesting is that Jacqueline and I have known each other for years. But she moved down to San Diego. She used to pose for my students when I was teaching at Cal State Long Beach, and I had sort of lost track of her. And I thought, gosh, I remember telling my husband, Jacqueline would just be the perfect model for this, though. But now she's down in San Diego, and lo and behold, she started doing modeling sessions up at some of the studios, Disney and others. And so she was up in my area, my neck of the woods, and we would have her come by the studio in conjunction with those days. She'd spend the night, and then so it worked out really well. And I was so delighted, because she's absolutely the perfect model for this. So, and I really do have the model to thank. I always tell my students a good model makes all the difference. When you work with this level of realism, the model has to be good, and has to be able to, beyond just being beautiful, physically beautiful. Beauty is a real important part to my work. I admit it. I'm not an expressionist. I really am interested in beauty, but I'm interested in models that can sustain that kind of almost otherworldly, meditative suggestion that I want to have in my work, and she certainly is, works well for that. The other thing that I suppose is interesting about this is the model's actually upside down. She's not, of course. We have a high vantage point to her, but the idea of I knew when I was thinking about, when I had the pre-visualization for this pictorial idea, that I would be looking at the model from this way, that her head would be the closest thing, and that her body would be away from us, and I knew it would be a vertical. But again, these things can often take a while before they come to fruition. They float around in your head as ideas or as sketches. And this is the study. This one's not in the show. This one is not as developed as some of the other studies, which is one of the reasons I didn't want it in the show. But on the other hand, it's interesting, because if you can tell when you look at this is actually, I knew I needed something here, and I thought a purse, a bag. and I had this old bag that I'd saved. And what this is it's actually a tracing paper. I did the drawing I set the purse up and did a drawing of it, and then just stuck it right onto the composition study. So that's sometimes how elements can get added. And the one that I showed earlier of my cousin with the desert, where she's sitting in front of the mirror and there's a desert scene, those still life objects I had done on tracing paper and kept moving, because in the case of my work, something moved a quarter to an eighth of an inch can make a big difference. Again, to give you some idea of how deliberately and consciously I compose. Again, this enables me to do it on tracing paper, enables me to keep repositioning it. And it's easier to do it here. I wasn't with the car, obviously. Couldn't have done this drawing inside of a car anyway, but to be able to see it in two-dimensional and graphic form is a step in composing, which makes everything very evident. It's very clear what's happening compositionally when you're working with it in two dimensions, as opposed to an actual environment even. It's often easier to see what's going on. This is one which is not in the show. This is a recent piece, and it's actually, this one is it's 22 by 30, and this is at the Mount St. Mary's show. This is a very, very decrepit car. It's actually a Volkswagen, and as you can tell. And it was one, in fact, that not only was in a car junkyard, but apparently had been, people that, fiddle around with cars often build them with parts, and it was like two cars put together, basically. As you'll notice, part of it was red, part of it was blue. But I was fascinated with it as an interior. I took a lot of photos of it. But again, to give you an example, that landscape is actually from Utah. It's from an area around St. George. And again, the title of this piece is Off-Road Curves. Not only does it have to do with the fact that there's off-road vehicles here which have affected the landscape, but also the idea that the curve is the repeating motif throughout the guitar case. To give you some idea of how something like this is done, this was done, this as it's represented back here is pretty true to the way things were, not a lot of alterations. This did not exist here. This is completely invented, this foreground area. The guitar case was, again, an old friend came back into my life. I wanted to do this piece. I had the idea for this. I wanted a guitar case on the seat. Not a guitar, but a guitar case. And a friend of mine that I haven't seen in years came back into my life, and he said, well, I've got one in the garage you can use. So it was perfect. He's a wonderful musician, actually. And the light on the Volkswagen, from the photographs I have of the Volkswagen, was wholly unlike this. So I had to create light hitting the seats and things like that. It wasn't like that at all. Also, it was not hitting this that way, but I set this up in my studio, as well as the jacket, just on chairs, basically, in my studio, and then worked from those. And then had to kind of invent the way that the light would look, because I really couldn't get it to come through the window and hit this the way it would. Sunlight is very strong. And so I basically used, and then this I lit with a daylight spot. So again, to give you some idea of my working methods and how an image like this comes together. And there's a detail of the landscape. This was a pretty demanding landscape to produce. The thing about this that really, I changed the tire tracks in some of the areas, particularly in the foreground, to coincide again with some of the curves in the composition in certain ways. I'll make alterations there in the tire tracks, but the landform itself would be recognizable to someone who was familiar with the St. George area of Utah. But again, it's not one that is, even though it's fairly scenic and wonderful, it clearly, this was basically by a construction site, and clearly it's not protected at all, because off-roaders have left their marks all over it. And this is an example of, this is a quick kind of a charcoal study. And what's interesting about this is that the jacket, I just sort of made that up, but I ended up arranging the jacket in very close to what just a little quick visual kind of an indication. So I had a sense of how I wanted it to play into the composition, angles, and how it would be arranged. And then we're getting close to the end here. This is a charcoal study. This reclining figure is the first study in what will be a series of them for my latest piece, which will be even larger than Dry Birth, the one of Jacqueline in the red car. It's also going to be a vertical. And this one, the figure will be out of the car and on the desert floor, actually. He's in a sleeping bag. And there will be a car in it, but it'll be sort of parked off to the side. So it will be part of the automobile scene, but the figure's is actually out of the car now, so, but still desert landscape. And this is actually, well, you've seen this, and you know the size on this, and probably about 40 by 32. And I think that must be it. Now, having talked through this without taking questions, as I said, that's not characteristically how I conduct lectures. I'm really fond of being interrupted and having people ask questions, and so now I'll be happy if you guys can stand it, you can stand sitting any longer, to take any and all questions, and none of them are dumb. Just as I tell my students, ask anything, and I'll try and illuminate. That one must have questions. Was I that thorough that I answered everyone's questions? Or is everyone just burnt out? Yeah. The question is reflections, the idea of glass or water. Well, you know, depending on, when it comes to reflections, whether it's a still life object or it's water, the trick is context very often. You know, interestingly enough, and I tell my students that, it's that little highlight here and there. Everything about it, you can be working on a ceramic still life object and do all the detail on it, and it still could be matte finished. But it's those little highlights that you lick it with that will give the visual cue to the viewer that it's a high gloss object. There's also a lot there. You cannot underestimate the extent to which context will also cue the viewer in of what something is. There's an expectation that something is something, and the viewer suspends their disbelief, so to speak. The medium that you're using, whatever it is transformed into illusionistic substance. That's why I'm very careful very often to, you know, and with my students with their still lifes, I say certain objects need to be represented in certain ways for clarity, for the sake of clarity, and that you can really trip yourself up by positioning an object or using something which, although it may be a fascinating object to you, is confusing to the viewer. With this kind of work, things need to be, you need to be able to clearly read what they are. And that kind of relates, you know, to that. But really, it gets down to doing a really good rendering of what it is that you're seeing, including its tonality, its color, and then in the case of the, you know, the high gloss thing, including a reflection or a hot little highlight. And that's all it usually takes to take it from being, like I said, a ceramic object which could be matte finished to one which is highly reflective. Does that help? Yeah, I have people ask me that a lot, and you know, I've never considered myself to be a particularly neat person, but you know, if any smudging does happen, I'm pretty careful. I tend to work from top to bottom, from left to right. It's an unusual way of working. By the time I start putting pastel on the paper, I've done a lot of studies. I've pre-visualized to a great extent the overall color and tonality that I want, the ambient color quality, the overall tonality, the key, what we call the key of the piece. And I pretty much, you know, just sort of work on it in sections going from top to bottom, and also from left to right, and that helps me keep my hand out of it. On the other hand, if you do need to go back into an area and everything around it is finished, what I'll do is I'll drop what I call a glassine mask, so I can lean my hand in there, because there is no doubt that I need to keep my hand steady for certain things, you know, working as I do. And glassine paper looks like wax paper. It has no wax in it, but it picks up little or no pastel off of. In fact, it's used to cover pastels when they're in the interim, when they have not been framed. So it enables me to kind of lean my hand back in if I want to. But generally, I just work from top to bottom and avoid the smudging. The smudging can also be there, and it is there underneath all that, but I've simply worked back over it. You know, there'll be all kinds of smudges. As you see, the cartoon, the composition study for the one of my sister that was on the announcement tracks, you'll see all those smudges all over. That's from my hand, you know, getting the graphite on it. But in the pastel, it all gets covered over. Erased out and or covered over. I didn't actually time that, and the way that I figured out more or less a ballpark of the hours is because I timed one piece that I did, but it was actually a painting, and it might have even been the painting of you, and I wrote it down, but it was like 350. That was for the painting. Big things like that, just putting the pastel on. I don't know. I mean, I work on something like that, although not every day, but you're looking at 5 months. So it's several hundred hours, really, realistically, for something like that. Yeah, you're in for the long haul with those, definitely. It'd be nice to be able to work a little faster, but they take as much time as they're going to need to, and since I don't have production deadlines very often, I don't have to worry about it. It's not a commission piece. It's just something I'm working on. So.
Therapy.
Well, art does work as therapy, but I don't. Mine might be an obsession, but I don't want to think of it too much as therapy. I think it does have that use, but yeah, I mean, I do feel, I feel really fortunate. I really feel like I'm doing really pretty much exactly what I want to do, and that's a good place to be. And it's not everyone's cup of tea, but it's mine, and I'm happy to be there right now. That's something, the idea of showing, that's kind of what takes them out of, I suppose, this kind of direct reality or photo reality or a real literal transcription. There is. I want them to have kind of an extraordinary quality, and to have smudges on a windshield or whatever seems to be, for me, I don't know, it's something I don't want to do. I like the idea of clarity. For me, it's almost as if there is no glass in the windshield. And I'm more interested in the clarity of the landscape than I am in any kind of sort of verisimilitude regarding the way that window glass usually looks in cars. That's a really interesting question. What's interesting about the latest piece I did, the Volkswagen, is that's a pretty beat-up, weathered car. It actually didn't have glass in the windows. It had been broken out. I elected to not show the shards of glass all over the place, but the windows actually were absent in that vehicle. But I have seemed to have, I seem to be moving in a direction of with car interiors. Although I don't know how much longer I'll actually even do that series. It may complete itself very shortly. But I've moved in the direction of using cars which really have a lot of history and may be in a fairly advanced state of decrepitude. So. But actually, those shoes were my father's old hunting boots, and they fell apart in my hands. I dug them out of his garage, and he actually, I think he said he had them when he was in his 20s. I'm not going to say how long ago that was, but they actually started falling apart. Yeah, and the other comment that was made is that hat is not really a hat where, that one would see that someone who would be a rock hound would wear. And the gloves don't seem to be particularly dirty either. Again, I think it has to do with the fact that I'm not really interested in the scene as being a more kind of pedestrian accounting, factual kind of a thing. I really want it to be sort of beyond that. And I guess those kinds of things, whether you're conscious of them, such as you are, or someone responds to it subconsciously, it takes it out of the realm of the more common and gives it the possibility of being kind of transcendent and more extraordinary, because there's something weird there, something slightly strange about it. I actually, well, Jamie's husband said, it reminds me of, who was the comment? Someone, maybe it was, I don't know what artist said, chided Bonnard, and he said, that nude's never going to get out of the tub, if you're aware of Pierre Bonnard's work. He, for years, painted his wife in the bathtub, and it's a wonderful series, but some artist, it was probably Picasso, it sounds like a crack he would make, he said, that nude's never going to get out of the tub. Well, a friend of mine, Dan Sweetman, who's an artist, when are you going to get him out of the car? Well, as a matter of fact, that's happening. I mean, I'm very stubborn. I'm very deliberate and stubborn about what I do. And once this series exhausts itself, it will have exhausted itself. It's probably significant that the figure in the next work, the large one I'm doing, I am doing another car interior right now, a smaller 22 by 30. But the next really large one, sustained one that I do, the figure will not be in the car, but will certainly be in the desert landscape, and there will be an automobile there. And that has a lot to do with. If the automobile wasn't there, I think there would be a lot of questions, or in someone's mind, they might too quickly get to the fact that he may be dying there. There's a lot of implied threat. For me, the car represents that security, and so having it in proximity to him, even if he's out on the ground in a sleeping bag, again, it's somehow the relationship between the that mobile interior, which is what that is, although it's going to be all exterior. So, I follow my creative nose where it takes me, and this series at some point will no doubt come to an end. But it's been one I've been really focused on, and it's provided me a lot of creative grist thus far. It's actually in fact, and that's how I teach painting. You make a simultaneous observation of value and color. So it's really done at the same time. Yeah, I don't do like what would be the equivalent of what you would call a monochromatic underpainting or a grisaille and then working color over it. It's not done that way. There's a lot of layering done, and oftentimes what I do often do is that you will find the approximate complement. If I have an area, what I should say is that the areas which appear to be muted and gray are often composed, or comprised, I should say, of a number of very intense colors. And they're layered. And in the layering, you end up with what we call a tertiary, which is a grade color, essentially. But I wouldn't take, if something looks very muted, chances are I haven't started with a muted color, but rather there's been a layering of very vibrant colors, what we call high chroma colors, which go into the final appearance of what seems to be a kind of a neutral grade color, and they're layered. I often will also start off with complements. If the area is going to end up being kind of greenish, I may have a lot of really warm underneath. It causes a kind of it's very vibrant that way. It creates a kind of luminosity that would not occur to the extent that it does if you just kind of went for what was there, what you saw. So again, to arrive at any one area, particularly large areas of solid color that you would find in the car interior, there's often a layering of several colors in that, and oftentimes the approximate complement. Like I said, if it ends up red, chances are there was a lot of green underneath, for instance, in the red car. The reverse is true for cars which are kind of greenish. If it's bluish, it was kind of orangish. Again, it's kind of complementary. So, but I almost never will get the final effect from the first shot. There's a lot of very meticulous layering that goes into it. And again, it creates that kind of luminosity. It's also really functioning with the white of the paper. Even though they appear to be opaque, there's no doubt that the white of the paper, because if I used colored paper, for instance, a toned paper like a gray paper, these would have really a different appearance than they do. I like working with white paper because, again, that quality of luminosity is achieved in part because of the white. And in a sense, that's kind of related to watercolor. They're certainly not as transparent as watercolor, but they have a translucence to them. And the way that it looks is in part the result of the fact that the ground is white as opposed to a toned color. Any others? Well, thank you all for sitting through this. Thank you for your endurance.